The courthouse in Dry Laurel hadn't seen this much commotion since the railroad men first rolled into town 3 summers back. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through cracked windows as townspeople pressed against the glass, craning their necks to witness what would surely become local legend. Inside, Judge Morrison's gavel trembled in his weathered hand as he stared at the most unlikely pair ever to stand before his bench. Jake Deadeye Sullivan stood shackled at the wrists, his dark hair matted with sweat and 3 days of jail grime. The man who'd once been the fastest draw in 3 counties now looked like a cornered animal, his steel-gray eyes darting between the exit and the woman beside him. That woman, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore as she'd introduced herself, cut an imposing figure in her brown wool dress and pristine white veil. Her substantial frame spoke of good living, but her unwavering gaze suggested something far more dangerous than mere prosperity. "Do you, Eleanor Whitmore, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband?" Judge Morrison's voice cracked slightly on the words. He'd married plenty of desperate couples in his time, but never one where the bride had walked into his chambers an hour earlier, with a leather satchel full of silver dollars and a marriage license already bearing both signatures. "I do," Eleanor replied, her voice steady as bedrock. The judge turned to Jake, whose jaw worked silently as he processed the surreal turn his life had taken. Just that morning, he'd been measuring the distance from his cell to the gallows being constructed in the town square. Now he stood beside a woman he'd never seen before, about to become her husband, in what could only be described as the strangest escape plan in the history of the American frontier. "And do you, Jacob Sullivan, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife?" Jake's throat felt dry as desert sand. Behind Eleanor's veil he caught glimpses of intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see straight through him. She'd paid his bail, all $800 of it, without blinking. She'd somehow convinced the sheriff to allow this ceremony instead of the hanging scheduled for dawn, and now she waited for his answer with the patience of someone who already knew what it would be. I do. Hey there, friend. Before we continue with Jake and Eleanor's incredible story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I love hearing from folks all across the country who share a passion for these frontier stories. The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Judge Morrison pronounced them man and wife with obvious relief, eager to be done with whatever scheme he'd been paid handsomely to facilitate. As the shackles came off Jake's wrists, he flexed his fingers and felt the familiar ache for his Colt .45, confiscated when they'd dragged him in for the killing of Deputy Barnes. That shooting had been clean, self-defense when Barnes drew first, but Sheriff Hawkins had painted it as cold-blooded murder. Now, as Jake looked at his new bride, he wondered if he'd simply traded one kind of prison for another. Eleanor gathered her skirts and moved toward the courthouse door with purposeful strides. "Come along, husband," she said, the word carrying weight he couldn't yet fathom. "We have much to discuss." The crowd parted as they emerged into the blazing afternoon sun. Jake squinted against the glare, his eyes adjusting to freedom he'd never expected to taste again. Eleanor's carriage waited at the hitching post, a well-maintained buggy pulled by 2 sturdy mares that spoke of money and careful planning. As she climbed aboard with surprising grace for her size, Jake hesitated. "You getting in, or you planning to walk to your new home?" Eleanor asked, gathering the reins with practiced hands. Jake climbed up beside her, acutely aware of the townspeople's stares and whispered conversations. As they rolled down Main Street, past the saloon where he'd shared his last drink as a free man, and the general store where wanted posters still bore his likeness, he finally found his voice. "Why?" The single word carried the weight of a dozen questions. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road ahead, where the town gave way to rolling prairie dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cottonwood. "Because, Mr. Sullivan, we both have problems that require unconventional solutions." They rode in silence for the better part of an hour, the only sounds the rhythmic clop of hooves and the creak of leather. Jake studied the landscape, noting escape routes out of habit, but also observing the subtle signs of prosperity that marked Eleanor's property. The fences were well maintained, the cattle healthy and numerous. This wasn't the spread of some desperate widow looking for protection. This was the domain of someone with resources and intelligence. The house that came into view confirmed his assessment. 2 stories of solid timber and stone with a wraparound porch and windows that gleamed like watchful eyes. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals that spoke of serious horse breeding. This was a working ranch and a successful one. "Welcome to the Whitmore Ranch," Eleanor said as they pulled up to the front porch. Your new home, for better or worse. As Jake helped her down from the carriage, he caught the scent of her perfume, something floral and expensive that seemed at odds with the frontier setting. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of a woman in her 30s, someone who'd lived enough life to know exactly what she wanted. The hands are out checking the north pasture, Eleanor explained as they climbed the porch steps. We'll have privacy for our conversation. The interior of the house surprised Jake with its refinement. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings in gilded frames adorned the walls. This wasn't frontier living. This was civilization transplanted to the wilderness with careful attention to detail. Eleanor removed her veil and hat, revealing auburn hair pinned in an elaborate style that had probably taken her maid an hour to perfect. Without the veil's softening effect, her face showed the determined set of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a leather chair beside the fireplace. "We have business to discuss." Jake remained standing, his instincts screaming that sitting would put him at a disadvantage. "I'm grateful for what you did back there, ma'am, but I need to know what you expect in return." Eleanor moved to a sideboard and poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter. She offered one to Jake, who accepted it but didn't drink. "What I expect, Mr. Sullivan, is a partnership. You see, we both have enemies in dry laurel, and separately we're vulnerable. Together we might just survive what's coming." "What enemies?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew part of the answer. "Sheriff Hawkins for one, Prison Director Coleman for another, and behind them both, Railroad Baron Marcus Thornfield." Eleanor sipped her whiskey, watching Jake's reaction over the rim of her glass. "They've been selling prisoners as slave labor to Thornfield's iron mines up in the mountains. Men go in, but they don't come out." Jake's blood ran cold. "My brother Tommy was supposed to be transferred to the territorial prison last month, but when I asked about visiting him, they told you he'd been moved to a work detail," Eleanor finished. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, but your brother is likely dead, along with dozens of other men whose only crime was being friendless and poor." The whiskey glass shattered in Jake's grip, amber liquid and blood mixing on the Persian rug. Eleanor didn't flinch at the violence of his reaction, merely reached for a clean towel and handed it to him. "How do you know all this?" Jake's voice was deadly quiet. "Because they want my land," Eleanor replied. "The railroad needs a water source for their new line, and I own the only artesian well for 50 miles. They've made offers, then threats, and when those failed, they started targeting my ranch hands. 3 good men have disappeared in the past 2 months, all arrested on trumped-up charges." Jake wrapped the towel around his bleeding hand, his mind racing. "So you married me to what? Have a gunfighter on your payroll?" "I married you because a married woman has legal protections a widow doesn't, and because a man with your reputation might make them think twice about their more direct approaches." Eleanor moved to the window, gazing out at the approaching dusk. "But mostly, I married you because you're the only person in this territory with as much reason to want them dead as I do." The sun was setting by the time Eleanor led Jake upstairs to what she called his room, a spacious chamber with its own wash basin and a window overlooking the ranch's main approach. Jake noted the heavy lock on the door and the bars on the windows, subtle but unmistakable. "The evening meal will be ready shortly," Eleanor said, pausing in the doorway. "I trust you'll join me in the dining room." It wasn't really a request. Jake nodded, still processing everything she'd told him. As her footsteps faded down the hallway, he moved to the window and studied the layout below. The bunkhouse was dark. If there were ranch hands, they weren't back yet. The barn doors stood open, revealing the shadowy forms of horses in their stalls. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but Jake's instincts told him otherwise. Dinner was a surprisingly civilized affair. Eleanor had changed into a deep blue dress that complemented her coloring, and she'd arranged her hair in a softer style that made her look younger, more approachable. The table was set with fine china and silver, and the meal, roast beef with potatoes and vegetables, was expertly prepared. "You have a cook?" Jake asked, cutting into the tender meat. "I have many talents, Mr. Sullivan. Cooking is among the more conventional ones." Eleanor smiled, and for a moment Jake glimpsed the woman she might have been under different circumstances. "I was educated back east before my father brought me out here to help run the ranch." "What happened to your father?" "Pneumonia. 3 winters ago. He left me the ranch and enough money to run it properly, but not enough to fight a railroad baron with political connections." Eleanor's expression hardened. "That's where you come in." After dinner, Eleanor led Jake to her study, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive oak desk covered in papers and ledgers. She lit an oil lamp and gestured for him to sit across from her. "Now," she said, opening a leather-bound journal, "let me show you exactly what we're up against." The journal contained meticulous records of every suspicious arrest, every disappeared prisoner, every unexplained death in the county over the past year. Eleanor had documented names, dates, and circumstances with the thoroughness of a trained investigator. "How did you gather all this?" Jake asked, impressed despite himself. "I have friends in town. The doctor who treats the prisoners, the clerk who processes the paperwork, the telegraph operator who sends messages to the territorial capital." Eleanor turned a page, revealing a hand-drawn map of the area. "They've been selling information to me for months, piece by piece." Jake studied the map, noting the locations marked with red ink. "These are the mine sites? The official ones, yes. But there are others. Unmarked claims where they take the prisoners to work. Men who go there don't come back to tell tales." Eleanor's finger traced a route through the mountains. "I believe that's where they took your brother." The room fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Jake stared at the map, his jaw working as he processed the implications. Tommy had been just 19, arrested for stealing a horse he'd been trying to return to its rightful owner. The kid had always been too trusting, too willing to help strangers. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked finally. Eleanor closed the journal and leaned back in her chair. "Tomorrow night, there's a train coming through Dry Laurel. It's carrying a shipment of prisoners bound for the territorial prison, or so the paperwork says. In reality, it's headed for the mines. You want me to stop the train?" "I want us to stop the train," Eleanor corrected, "and rescue the prisoners and gather evidence of what Hawkins and Coleman have been doing. Evidence we can take to the territorial governor." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're talking about taking on a sheriff, a prison director, and a railroad baron. That's not a fight. That's suicide." "Perhaps, but it's the only chance those men have, and the only chance we have of stopping this before more innocent people die." Eleanor stood and moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the star-filled sky. "I won't lie to you, Mr. Sullivan. This is dangerous and we might not survive it. But if we do nothing, we're dead anyway. They'll find a way to eliminate both of us eventually." Jake joined her at the window, studying her profile in the lamplight. "Why should I trust you? For all I know, this is some elaborate trap." Eleanor turned to face him, and in her eyes Jake saw something he recognized, the same desperate determination that had driven him to become one of the fastest guns in the territory. "Because, Mr. Sullivan, we're both running out of options. And because sometimes the only way to survive is to stop running and start fighting." The clock chimed 10 as Eleanor led Jake back upstairs. At the door to his room, she paused and withdrew a key from her pocket. "I'm locking this door," she said matter-of-factly. "Not to keep you prisoner, but to keep you alive. If you try to leave tonight, Hawkins' men will be waiting. They're watching the roads and they'll shoot you on sight." Jake's hand moved instinctively toward where his gun should have been. "And if you stay, we have a chance to make them pay for what they've done. To your brother, to my ranch hands, to all the others." Eleanor inserted the key and turned it with a decisive click. "Good night, husband. Tomorrow we begin our real work." Jake listened to her footsteps fade down the hallway, then tested the door. Locked solid. He moved to the window and examined the bars. Old but sturdy, set deep into the frame. Eleanor had been thorough in her preparations. As he settled into the surprisingly comfortable bed, Jake found himself thinking about the woman who'd become his wife in such strange circumstances. She was clearly intelligent, resourceful, and determined. But was she trustworthy? And more importantly, was her plan suicide or salvation? Outside, an owl called from the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. The sounds of the frontier night that had once comforted Jake now seemed ominous, full of hidden threats and uncertain futures. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows in delicate patterns. Jake woke to the sound of the key turning in his lock, followed by Eleanor's voice calling him to breakfast. He dressed quickly in the clean clothes she'd provided, simple ranch wear that fit surprisingly well, and made his way downstairs. Eleanor was already seated at the dining table, dressed in practical riding clothes and looking every inch the ranch owner she was. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore a gun belt with a well-maintained Colt 38 at her hip. "You're armed," Jake observed, taking his seat. "I've been armed since I was 16, Eleanor replied, pouring coffee from a silver pot. "My father believed a woman should be able to protect herself, especially out here. Can you use it?" Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. "Would you like a demonstration?" After breakfast, Eleanor led Jake on a tour of the ranch, introducing him to the hands who'd returned from their work in the north pasture. They were good men. Jake could tell by the way they carried themselves and the respect they showed their employer. But he also noticed the way they watched the horizon, the casual way they kept their weapons close at hand. These weren't just cowboys. They were soldiers in an undeclared war. "Mrs. Whitmore's been good to us," said Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman, as they inspected the horses in the main corral. "We'll stand by her, whatever comes." Jake nodded, understanding the unspoken message. These men would fight for Eleanor, but they'd also be watching him, ready to act if he proved to be a threat to their employer. As the day progressed, Eleanor shared more details of her plan. The train would arrive in Dry Laurel just after midnight, stopping only long enough to take on water before continuing to the mountains. During that brief stop, they would need to overpower the guards, free the prisoners, and gather the evidence they needed to expose the conspiracy. "The train car they use for prisoners is specially modified," Eleanor explained, showing Jake detailed sketches she'd somehow obtained. "Steel bars, reinforced locks, only one way in or out. It's designed to be a mobile prison cell." "How many guards?" "Usually 4 plus the engineer and conductor. But they'll be expecting trouble. Word of your escape will have reached them by now." Jake studied the sketches, his tactical mind automatically calculating angles of attack and potential problems. "This is going to be messy." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "but it's our only chance to get the evidence we need and save those men." As evening approached, Eleanor led Jake to her study once more. This time she opened a hidden panel in the wall, revealing a cache of weapons that would have impressed a cavalry unit. Rifles, pistols, ammunition, and even a few sticks of dynamite. Eleanor had been preparing for war. "Choose your weapons," she said, selecting a Winchester rifle for herself. "We leave in 2 hours." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he picked up his familiar Colt 45, returned to him from Eleanor's collection. The weight of it felt like coming home, but it also reminded him of all the men he'd killed, all the violence that had led him to this moment. "Having second thoughts?" Eleanor asked, checking the action on her rifle. "Just wondering if there's another way." "There isn't." Eleanor's voice was flat, final. "I've tried legal channels, tried negotiation, tried everything civilized society has to offer. They responded with threats and murder. Now we respond in kind." The ride to Dry Laurel took place under a moonless sky, with only the stars to light their way. Eleanor had chosen their route carefully, avoiding the main roads and using cattle trails that would keep them hidden from any watchers. They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. As they approached the town, Jake could see the glow of the train station's oil lamps in the distance. The locomotive was already there, a massive iron beast breathing steam into the cold night air. Eleanor led them to a position on a low hill overlooking the tracks where they could observe without being seen. "There," Eleanor whispered, pointing to a car near the rear of the train. "That's the prison car." Jake studied the scene through a pair of field glasses Eleanor had brought. He could see guards patrolling the platform, their rifles gleaming in the lamplight. The prison car was exactly as Eleanor had described, a fortress on wheels with barred windows and reinforced doors. "How do we get close enough?" Jake asked. Eleanor smiled grimly. "We don't go to them, we make them come to us." She produced a stick of dynamite from her saddlebag, along with a long fuse and a box of matches. "The water tower. If we blow it, they'll have to stop and investigate. That's when we make our move." Jake stared at her in amazement. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I've had months to plan this, Mr. Sullivan. Months to think about my dead ranch hands and your dead brother and all the other men who've disappeared into those mines." Eleanor's eyes glittered with cold fury. "Tonight we make them pay." They crept through the darkness toward the water tower, a wooden structure that loomed against the star-filled sky like a giant's drinking cup. Eleanor worked quickly and efficiently, placing the dynamite at the base of the tower and lighting the fuse with steady hands. "Run," she whispered, and they sprinted back toward their horses as the fuse burned down toward its deadly cargo. The explosion lit up the night like a miniature sun, sending splinters of wood and torrents of water cascading across the train yard. Shouts erupted from the platform as guards rushed toward the destruction, leaving the prison car momentarily unguarded. "Now!" Eleanor hissed, and they spurred their horses toward the train. Jake's world narrowed to the thunder of hooves, the weight of his gun in his hand, and the desperate knowledge that everything depended on the next few minutes. As they reached the train, he could see faces pressed against the barred windows of the prison car, hollow-eyed men who'd given up hope of rescue. Eleanor dismounted and ran toward the car's door, producing a set of lockpicks from her coat. Jake positioned himself to cover her, his Colt trained on the platform where confused guards were still trying to understand what had happened. "Almost got it," Eleanor muttered, working frantically at the lock. That's when Jake saw Sheriff Hawkins emerge from the locomotive, his face twisted with rage and recognition. The sheriff's hand dropped toward his gun, and Jake knew their time had run out. "Eleanor!" he shouted, but she was already moving, rolling away from the door as Hawkins's bullet splintered the wood where her head had been. Jake's return shot took the sheriff in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. More guards were running toward them now, their rifles raised and ready to fire. "The lock!" Eleanor called out, tossing Jake the picks as she drew her own weapon. Jake holstered his Colt and attacked the lock with desperate fingers, feeling the mechanism give way just as bullets began to fly in earnest. The door swung open, revealing a dozen prisoners chained to the walls of their mobile cell. "We're here to help," Jake shouted over the gunfire. "Can you move?" "The chains," gasped one of the prisoners, a young man who looked heartbreakingly like Tommy. "Keys are with the guard." Jake looked around frantically and spotted a guard's body near the platform. He sprinted toward it, dodging bullets and praying his luck would hold. The keys were there, hanging from the dead man's belt, and Jake snatched them up before racing back to the prison car. Eleanor was holding her own against the remaining guards, her rifle barking steadily as she picked off targets with deadly precision. But Jake could see more men emerging from the town, drawn by the sounds of battle. "We need to move," he called out as he unlocked the prisoner's chains. "The evidence," Eleanor replied, reloading her rifle. "Coleman's office. There's a safe with all the records." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "We can't fight the whole town." "We don't have to fight them all," Eleanor said, her voice eerily calm. "Just long enough to get what we came for." The freed prisoners were streaming out of the car now, some of them grabbing weapons from fallen guards. Jake recognized the look in their eyes. Men who'd been pushed beyond their breaking point and were ready to fight back. "The office is in the station building," Eleanor continued, pointing toward a two-story structure at the far end of the platform. "Second floor, corner room." Jake looked at the building, then at the growing number of armed men between them and their objective. It was madness, but it was also their only chance to expose the conspiracy and prevent more innocent deaths. "All right," he said, checking his ammunition. "But we do this fast and we do it together." Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, Jake saw genuine warmth in her expression. "Together," she agreed. They fought their way across the platform like avenging angels, Eleanor's rifle and Jake's pistol cutting down anyone who stood in their way. The freed prisoners followed, their rage giving them strength they'd thought lost forever. It was chaos and violence and desperate hope all rolled into one terrible, beautiful moment. The station building's front door exploded inward under Jake's boot, and they raced up the stairs toward Coleman's office. Eleanor produced another stick of dynamite, and Jake realized she'd been planning for this contingency all along. "Stand back," she warned, lighting the fuse. The safe door blew open in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, revealing stacks of documents and ledgers that told the whole sordid story. Names, dates, payments, correspondence with railroad officials, everything they needed to bring down the conspiracy. "Got it," Eleanor said, stuffing papers into a leather satchel. That's when they heard the sound that chilled Jake's blood, the whistle of an approaching train. Through the office window, he could see another locomotive bearing down on them, this one carrying what looked like a full company of armed men. "Reinforcements," Eleanor said grimly. "Thornfield's private army." Jake grabbed her hand. "Time to go." They raced back down the stairs and out onto the platform, where the freed prisoners were making their last stand against overwhelming odds. The new train was slowing, and Jake could see uniformed men preparing to disembark. "The horses!" Eleanor shouted over the gunfire. But their mounts were on the far side of the yard, and between them and escape lay a gauntlet of armed men who wanted them dead. Jake calculated the odds and didn't like what he found. "This way," he said, leading Eleanor toward the locomotive of the prison train. The engineer was long gone, but Jake had learned enough about steam engines during his wandering years to get the massive machine moving. As the locomotive lurched forward, Eleanor climbed into the cab beside him. "Where are we going?" she asked. Jake grinned fiercely as he opened the throttle. To finish this, the locomotive gathered speed as it pulled away from the station, carrying them into the darkness of the mountain passes. Behind them, the sounds of battle faded, replaced by the rhythmic chuff of the engine and the clatter of wheels on steel rails. "The mines," Eleanor said, understanding his plan. "You want to hit them where they're holding the other prisoners. Your evidence will expose the conspiracy," Jake replied, wrestling with the controls as the train climbed into the foothills. "But those men in the mines will die before any help can reach them. This is our only chance to save them." Eleanor nodded, checking her remaining ammunition. "How many do you think are up there?" "Too many," Jake admitted. "But we've got surprise on our side, and a locomotive makes a hell of a battering ram." The train climbed higher into the mountains, following tracks that led to the hidden mining operations Eleanor had mapped so carefully. As dawn approached, they could see smoke rising from the valley ahead, the telltale signs of the illegal mines where so many men had disappeared. "There," Eleanor pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled against the mountainside. "That's where they're holding them." Jake studied the layout as they approached. Guard towers, barbed wire, barracks for the overseers. It looked more like a military prison than a mining operation. But he could also see the weakness in their defenses. They weren't expecting an attack by locomotive. "Hold on," he warned Eleanor, then opened the throttle wide. The locomotive smashed through the main gate like it was made of matchsticks, scattering guards and sending up a cloud of dust and debris. Jake applied the brakes, bringing the massive machine to a grinding halt in the center of the compound. "Now," he shouted, leaping from the cab with his guns blazing. What followed was the most intense firefight of Jake's violent career. He and Eleanor fought side by side, their weapons speaking in deadly harmony as they cut through the surprised guards. The prisoners, seeing their chance for freedom, rose up against their captors with makeshift weapons and desperate courage. In the midst of the battle, Jake found himself face to face with prison director Coleman, a fat man in an expensive suit who looked more like a banker than a warden. Coleman's hand shook as he pointed a derringer at Jake's chest. "You've ruined everything," Coleman snarled. "Do you have any idea how much money you've cost us?" "Not nearly enough," Jake replied, and put a bullet between the man's eyes. When the smoke cleared, they'd freed nearly 50 prisoners and captured enough evidence to hang every corrupt official in the territory. But the cost had been high. Several of the freed men had died in the fighting, and both Jake and Eleanor bore wounds that would leave permanent scars. As they stood among the ruins of the mining operation, watching the surviving guards being herded into the same cells that had held their victims, Eleanor turned to Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. "It's over," she said simply. "The fighting, maybe," Jake replied. "But what about us? What about this marriage of convenience?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the morning light. "I suppose that depends on whether you want it to be convenient or something more." Jake thought about everything they'd been through together. The desperate plan, the violent night, the trust they'd built in the crucible of combat. Eleanor wasn't the woman he'd imagined himself marrying, but she was strong, intelligent, and brave enough to stand beside him when the bullets were flying. "I reckon," he said slowly, "that convenience is overrated." Eleanor smiled, and this time there was nothing calculating or strategic about it. "I was hoping you'd say that." 6 months later, the territorial governor himself came to Dry Laurel to present Jake and Eleanor with commendations for their service to justice. The evidence they'd gathered had led to the arrest and conviction of dozens of corrupt officials, and the illegal mining operations had been shut down permanently. Sheriff Hawkins had survived his wounds, only to find himself on the wrong side of prison bars. The railroad baron Marcus Thornfield had fled to Mexico rather than face trial, leaving behind an empire built on blood and corruption. Jake and Eleanor's marriage had evolved from a desperate alliance into something deeper and more lasting. They worked the ranch together, Eleanor handling the business side while Jake managed security and the day-to-day operations. The ranch hands had accepted him as one of their own, and the townspeople had learned to respect the man who'd helped bring justice to their community. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked about the future, plans for expanding the ranch, maybe starting a family. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other. The door that Eleanor had locked on their wedding night had indeed opened, but not in the way either of them had expected. It had opened onto a partnership built on mutual respect, shared danger, and the kind of trust that could only be forged in the crucible of violence and survival. Jake still wore his guns, and Eleanor still kept her rifle close at hand. The frontier was a dangerous place, and they'd made enemies who might someday seek revenge, but they faced those dangers together now, as partners in every sense of the word. And if sometimes Jake woke in the night, thinking about his brother Tommy and all the other men who hadn't lived to see justice done, Eleanor was there beside him, her presence a reminder that some fights were worth winning no matter the cost. The marriage that had begun as an escape from the gallows had become something neither of them had dared to hope for, a true partnership between two strong souls who'd found their match in each other. In a land where survival often meant standing alone, they'd discovered the power of standing together. As the stars came out over the Whitmore Ranch, Jake and Eleanor Sullivan sat side by side, planning for a future they'd fought hard to secure. The door was open now and they were walking through it together, into whatever adventures the frontier might bring.